Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into something pretty complex and, frankly, really important.
Yeah, we're looking at the ethics for mental health professionals when it comes to, well, political leaders.
Exactly. And we've got a whole range of sources: medical ethics, psychoanalyses, even stuff about societal health.
Our goal here really is to understand that ethical tightrope.
Yeah.
What happens when public figures show concerning behavior?
Right. What do these sources tell us about assessing leadership and maybe even the health of society itself?
That's the plan, to see what insights we can pull out.
Okay, so let's kick things off with the basics. The foundational ethical principles in medicine seem like a good place to start.
Absolutely. It gives us a framework. You've got things like the Physician's Pledge, which captures these core ideas.
Like beneficence,
Yeah,
acting for people's benefit.
exactly. And then there's non-maleficence, that's the big one. First, do no harm.
Uh-huh.
Plus, justice, respecting autonomy. These are all key.
And the sources emphasize that beneficence isn't just one-on-one, right? It's broader.
Definitely. It extends to the public. Think about public health measures, like stopping infectious diseases.
Right, protecting the community.
That's a form of beneficence, too, an obligation to the wider group.
Okay, so that brings us to the Goldwater Rule. You hear that term a lot. What was the original idea there?
Well, initially, it was sort of twofold. It was meant to help educate the public if questions came up about a figure,
Okay.
while also saying, hey, don't diagnose from afar, keep it professional, contribute to public health understanding, but, carefully.
But it sounds like things changed quite a bit, especially during the Trump administration. The sources call it a gag rule.
Yeah, that's the argument some make. The American Psychiatric Association, the APA, seemed to, well, reinterpret it pretty significantly.
How so?
Instead of helping professionals inform the public about potential concerns, it seemed to shut down that conversation.
And this happened quickly.
Very quickly, yeah, early in the Trump presidency. And some argue that really violated the original spirit.
And were there specific APA actions mentioned in the sources, not just general statements?
Oh, yes. For instance, pretty early on, they clarified the duty to warn.
The duty to warn potential victims.
Right. They said it only applied if you had an existing patient-therapist relationship.
Even though professionals were raising concerns about broader societal danger.
Exactly, which wasn't about a specific patient. Then later, in early 2018, this was after Dr. Lee mentioned briefing Congress,
Uh-huh.
the APA came out against armchair psychiatry and using psychiatry for, political gain.
But didn't Dr. Lee and others feel they were following APA guidelines that encourage consulting with government?
That's the seeming contradiction, yeah. They argued they were acting for public health, consulting as encouraged.
And the APA kept scrutinizing Dr. Lee,
Yeah.
mentioning her past resignation.
Yeah, even bringing up something from over a decade before about pharmaceutical ties, it really highlights how politically charged any psychiatric comment became.
It really does. Okay, this whole situation seems like fertile ground for this concept of malignant normality from Robert J. Lifton. What's that about?
Malignant normality. It's about how societies can start accepting things as normal, even when they're, well, destructive, or as Lifton puts it, even evil.
And this isn't always obvious. It's influenced
By the political climate, by military currents, by whoever holds power. These forces shape what seems acceptable.
He uses the Nazi doctors at Auschwitz as an example, which is chilling.
It is. He talks about how they adapted psychologically to doing horrific things, like selections. He calls it a perverse psychotherapy. They overcame their own distress to fit into that evil system.
So the concern Lifton raises in the context of the Trump era was a similar risk, accepting a new, harmful normal.
Exactly. He really pushed for professionals to resist just going along with it, to use their knowledge to expose it, but also be disciplined about what they actually know versus speculation.
And because the stakes are high with unstable leaders.
Especially when instability is combined with, a disregard for truth. That can shift societal norms very quickly.
The sources also get into the broader role of professions, how they relate to the state, especially when there are worries about abuse of power.
Yeah, Judith Lewis Herman and Bandy Lee make this point that professions can act as a sort of ethical buffer. They create a space for conversations with the government that might be too risky for an individual.
Like a collective voice.
Kind of. Professional standards offer some backing, some authority when challenging powerful entities.
But there was hesitation after the 2016 election. Professionals were afraid.
Very much so, according to the sources. Fear of government retaliation was real. People decline to sign letters, worried about being targeted. It shows how quickly self-censorship can set in.
Which raises a massive ethical question, doesn't it? Do professional ethics just stop at the Oval Office door?
That's the crux of it. If your ethics prioritize health and safety, do you just set that aside for the president?
The sources seem to argue no.
Right. They argue that abandoning those principles in the political realm could actually use the profession's own rules to compromise ethics.
So it boils down to, are professionals enabling potential state abuses, or are they resisting?
That's the framing. The ethical stance, they argue, is resistance, refusing to cooperate with anything that looks like a human rights violation.
And if you have special knowledge,
Then there's a responsibility to inform the public, especially if state power seems to be abused by someone potentially unstable. You see figures like Dr. Solds, Post, Marikangas, Gorgashon trying to engage the APA, raising these alarms.
okay, let's shift to the psychological characteristics discussed.
Yeah.
The sources stress it's not simple, not just bad versus mad.
Exactly. John Gartner talks about that complexity, maybe a mix of what looks like bad behavior and potentially mad elements like a hypomanic temperament, high energy, needing constant stimulation.
And Michael Tansey brings up delusional disorder. That sounds serious.
It does, especially considering some statements that seem, well, detached from reality and the expressed admiration for certain dictators.
Tansey asks if it's strategic, crazy like a fox, or actual delusion, crazy like a crazy.
And he stresses that distinction is critical given the global stakes, especially nuclear ones. The attraction to figures like Kim Jong-un or Putin, he suggests, might fit with grandiose or paranoid delusions.
David Rice also notes there are no real cognitive standards for the presidency.
Which is a huge gap, right? The job demands incredible mental acuity. Rice mentions clinicians might see hints of decline publicly, but a real diagnosis needs a full workup.
And he cautions about experts offering opinions without examining someone.
Yeah, the potential for bias is always there. Plus, we even have a guardianship attorney, Clark Erb, who apparently considered a preliminary finding of mental incapacity based on public behavior.
That's a different angle, legal incapacity.
It shows the breadth of concern coming from different professional viewpoints focused on function and capacity.
Now, Rosemary Sword and Philip Zimbardo talk about extreme present hedonism. What is that?
It's basically acting on impulse for immediate gratification, immediate self-aggrandizement, without thinking about tomorrow. Often linked with paranoia, too.
So like impulsive tweets or remarks.
Could be, yeah. A thoughtless action happens, and then everyone else scrambles to react or manage the fallout. It's unpredictable.
And they link this to dehumanizing others and narcissism and bullying.
There's a strong connection, yes. Dehumanizing helps maintain that self-focus. It dismisses the impact on others, which ties into narcissistic traits and bullying patterns. The sources cite specific Trump quotes as examples of this alleged hedonistic style, touching on distrust and racism.
Okay, so narcissism itself. What are the key features Sword and Zimbardo highlight?
Things like needing constant praise, believing you're special, entitlement, and crucially, difficulty recognizing or empathizing with others' feelings.
And bullying isn't just occasional meanness.
No, it's systematic, repeated harm, physical or emotional. It might link to narcissism or sometimes just misreading social cues, often learned, driven by a need for control and superiority over perceived weaker targets.
Then there's malignant narcissism. How's that different?
It's like narcissism plus psychopathy. Eric Fromm and Otto Kernberg explored this. It's seeing others purely as pawns, tools for your own ends, sometimes with real ruthlessness. Think historical tyrants, that's often the comparison made.
Gail Sheehy zeroes in on a lack of trust as maybe the biggest problem.
Yeah, she argues that beneath the narcissism or paranoia, the core issue might be this profound inability to trust anyone. And that, she thinks, could be catastrophic for a leader and the nation.
Relying purely on instincts in a complex world.
Especially when alienating allies and advisors, it's risky. Sheehy even raises the concern about a leader maybe needing a war as a distraction from domestic problems.
And this distrust poisons the internal workings, too, within the administration.
Absolutely. If a leader doesn't trust their team, how can they inspire trust? Loyalty becomes conditional, truth gets shaky. Sheehy points to examples where advisors were undercut by the leader's own contradictory statements.
And internationally, alliances, agreements.
The same distrust extends outwards, according to the sources. Doubting NATO, NAFTA, stemming from a worldview that everyone's out to get you. This can fuel demonizing certain groups and, again, a disconnect from factual reality like The wiretapping accusations against Obama?
Lance Dodds discusses sociopathy. He says focus on the traits.
Yeah, he says don't get too hung up on the perfect label. Sociopathy, psychopathy, antisocial personality, malignant narcissism often overlap. Look at the observable behaviors.
Like, what are the key traits of sociopathy?
A kind of predatory empathy, understanding others just enough to manipulate them, but without caring about their welfare. Pathological lying, impulsivity, lack of remorse or guilt. It's a pursuit of power and admiration without genuine connection.
And Dodds thinks there's enough public information to assess this.
He argues yes. The long public record of words and actions provides data to assess dangerousness based on these traits, whether you use DSM criteria for antisocial personality disorder or the concept of malignant narcissism.
Paranoia comes up again. How is it defined here?
Not necessarily a full-blown disorder, but as a personality trait, an exaggerated sense of danger, assuming others have bad intentions. The reliance on conspiracy sources like InfoWars is cited as a potential indicator.
Michael Tansey again draws parallels to historical tyrants. Why
Yeah.
is that comparison made?
To show that this cluster of traits, malignant narcissism, has appeared before in leaders who caused immense harm. He pushes back against the idea that such a leader might suddenly become more presidential. Success, he argues, often makes malignant narcissists worse, bolder.
And he really hammers home the crazy, like a fox versus crazy, like a crazy question.
Yes, because the implications are so vast. Are the actions calculated or driven by delusions? He lists characteristics of delusional thinking.
Like what?
Being thin-skinned about the delusions being central to their existence, often getting worse over time. And crucially, their words and actions make sense within the delusional framework.
He gives examples of false statements.
Lots of them, knowing more than generals, best temperament, guilt of the Central Park Five, celebrating Muslims on 9/11, being a top baseball prospect, the electoral landslide claim. He suggests these fit potential grandiose and paranoid delusions.
David Rice brings us back to cognitive function and the demands of the job.
Right, the need for constant alertness. He acknowledges that while you might see concerning signs publicly, you can't diagnose dementia without proper tests. And again, cautions about unsolicited opinions from potentially biased experts. There's no good system to check cognitive risk in candidates.
Clerk Erb also mentioned the 25th Amendment again, right? And alternative ways to assess capacity.
Yeah, he worried about a Scorpion King scenario where a president becomes incapacitated. He reflected on the Electoral College's original intent, wisdom, and judgment, not just party loyalty, quoting Hamilton and Justice Jackson.
But he acknowledged the standard for professional comment.
Yes, usually requires an in-person exam. But he also argued that persistent paranoia is a dangerous sign, often seen in authoritarians. And some danger signs, he felt, are obvious even without training, citing specific statements about violence or nuclear use.
James Gilligan focuses on danger to others. He seems quite strong on this point.
He is. Gilligan, who studies violence, argues that if experts don't identify extreme dangerousness when the signs are there, it's incompetence or irresponsibility. He lists more examples suggesting violence against opponents, the Access Hollywood tape, and talks about the Trump effect on children, the fear reported by therapists.
So his conclusion is quite stark.
Yes, that the patterns indicate a danger to others, with potentially massive global and environmental impact.
Howard Kovitz talks about that classic ethical bind, confidentiality versus the duty to warn.
Exactly. Don't go loose-lipped versus don't stand idly by. He asks if our focus should just be on freedom from disability or also on the potential to cause harm. He even brings in Freud's focus on empiricism, maybe avoiding value judgments about the good life.
And this idea of a paradigm crisis for professions when democracy itself feels threatened.
Right. Like journalists having to constantly fact-check basic reality. For therapists, it's balancing being a therapist and a citizen, dealing with their own stress, and clients reacting to the political climate, bullying fears, deportation anxiety, erosion of justice.
He even talks about political stress.
Yeah, public stress impacting personal well-being. He suggests asking clients about their public lives, helping them be grounded and responsive, not just numb or agitated, connecting personal agency and therapy to collective agency and democracy.
And he describes the post-election feeling as potentially traumatic.
For many, yes, likening it to traumatic shock, even PTSD symptoms. He references the APA's trauma definition, arguing the election and presidency were terrible, even disastrous events for some, leading to anxiety, hypervigilance, post-Trump traumatic stress.
A psycho-socio-political tornado, he calls it.
Yeah, a destabilizing force that disrupts thinking, makes people vulnerable to falsehoods. Trump keeping people in crisis mode via media floods, preventing thoughtful reflection. This led to what some called Trump anxiety disorder.
Amelia Reiner brings up other blaming. What's the dynamic there?
Driven by shame and fear, she says. The key flaw is a total lack of accountability. Difficulty with introspection, admitting fault, showing remorse. They feel they're above the rules, like not releasing tax returns.
She uses an analogy.
Justifying Justin, who never apologizes, always blames his partner. It erodes trust. Prioritizing being right over the relationship's health. She connects this to a leader prioritizing their fragile ego over the country's well-being, normalizing this kind of behavior.
Thomas Singer looks at national insecurity, the rise of otherness.
How 9/11 shook things up, leading to confronting ethnic and religious others. He contrasts this with divisive rhetoric that, he argues, corrodes unity. He uses birtherism as an example of using falsehoods and bigotry transactionally just to win, which damages democratic values.
Elizabeth Mika connects tyranny directly to narcissistic psychopathy.
She argues it's a core trait of all tyrants' impaired conscience, insatiable power drive masking deficits. This forms their charisma. It attracts followers who project their own hopes onto the leader, leading to identification, shutting down reason. Tyrannies thrive in conditions of inequality, fear, moral confusion.
Edwin Fisher uses the Cuban Missile Crisis as a counterexample, right? Good crisis leadership.
Exactly. Kennedy sought diverse counsel, got conflicting advice, made a measured decision, responded to the conciliatory message. Contrast that with a leader isolated with loyalists. Fisher stresses the importance of social networks for resilience variety, not just numbers. Being locked in one role is bad.
He mentions Nixon.
Nixon's isolation near the end, on a thin precipice, raises concerns about Trump's impact on trust with allies, citing things like the Comey firing or sharing intel with Russia, the danger of flawed leaders making huge decisions in isolation.
Ninette Gartrell and Dee Mosbacher circle back to nuclear command. The lack of checks.
It's stark, isn't it? Carter lamented it back in '94. We vet military personnel rigorously for nuclear roles, but not the commander-in-chief. They list Trump's campaign behaviors they saw as temperamentally unfit for that responsibility, blurring fact fiction, rage, impulsivity. No evidence of psych testing for him or prior presidents.
They list other concerning behaviors, too.
Undermining judiciary, praising authoritarians, dehumanizing language, dogs, animals, tapping into alt-right rhetoric, the Charlottesville fine people comment.
James Marikangas and Joanna Lateef really raise the stakes, human survival.
Marikangas, having seen a nuclear test, urges fitness evaluations given the proximity to annihilation. Lateef shares her experience under nuclear threat. They also hit climate change, the disproportionate risk to the poor, the dangers of charismatic leaders in times of threat.
So professionals have a role regarding climate, too.
Yes, understanding climate trauma, but also pushing for leadership action. They list Trump administration actions seen as harmful to climate security, like leaving the Paris Accords. Putting people in harm's way is aggression, they argue. Psychiatrists need to engage on climate risks and leadership.
Prudence Gergeshon also revisits the 25th Amendment.
Using Reagan's confusion during Iran-Contra as an example of potential incapacity. She discusses Raskin's bill for a medical body and Blumenauer's for one with former officials. Without something like this, she argues, the 25th Amendment's emergency option isn't really functional.
And she draws on military leadership principles.
Contrasting disciplined leadership, self-awareness, empathy, strategy, with visceral emotional reactions. She notes that leaders with dangerous disorders do attain power, often disastrously, but it's not always recognized due to stigma or misunderstanding different illness types. Normalizing dangerous personalities is a huge risk.
Finally, Norman Eisen and Richard Painter conclude on the 25th Amendment issues.
They stress the gap left by not having an independent body to assess inability, especially in polarized times. They argue both Raskin's and Blumenauer's proposals deserve real thought. They also warn about unforeseen crises and concentrated wealth, reminding us ultimately power rests with the governed, citing David Hume.
Wow. Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, a lot to process, but some key things stand out.
Definitely. The ethical duties of mental health professionals, it seems clear from these sources, go beyond the individual client. They touch on public well-being, assessing leadership.
Even when it's messy and political.
Right. And while diagnosing from afar is problematic, the sources argue that observable behavior and its potential impact nationally, globally, have to be considered.
It really leaves us with a big question, doesn't it, for our listeners to think about?
Yeah. Given everything we've discussed from these sources, what are the ongoing responsibilities here? For professionals, sure, but also for the public.
In making sure we have informed ethical leadership, it's something to really mull over, thinking about the long-term health of society and, well, global security.